My name is Brett Little, and I am the moderator here for the nonprofit, the Green Home Institute. And we're really going to be talking about just the green affordable housing opportunities, especially with the affordable housing crisis we have. And I'm very thankful to the speakers for, which wasn't originally planned, for addressing, COVID-19 and the aspects of what they've been working on. And before we get started, a huge thanks to our top tier sponsor, Build Equinox. They make a Serve 2, which is a smart ventilation system that detects pollution in the air and then ramps up to exhaust it, but doesn't run and overventilate the space and waste energy when it's not needed, unlike traditional ERVs. They've also added a UV to it now to kill pathogens and viruses in the air. You can get MERV 13 filtration or higher, which also stops viruses. So it's filtering, it's ventilating up to 300 CFM, so larger scale offices as well. And it has a heat pump integrated into it, so it's 100% comfort and can help pair with things like Mitsubishi mini splits as well to distribute that air around the house more efficiently. It's 100% solar powered, 100% American made product right in Illinois. Check it out at buildequinox.com. And a huge thanks to our secondary sponsors, Niagara Conservation. We have glowing reviews from affordable housing renovation specialists who say these 0.8 gallon per flush single flush toilets work. They work better. They're vacuum powered. And they save tons of water, with water bills just going up and up, either for tenants or for the landlords. So we're seeing these more and more in affordable housing projects. Check them out over at niagaracorporation.com. Well, I'm super excited to be presenting both of our speakers today, Kimberly Vermeer and Walker Wells, co-authors of the recently published book, Blueprint for Green Affordable Housing, the revised edition. Kimberly is the president of Urban Habitat Initiatives Incorporated, a Boston-based consulting practice working to advance sustainability and climate resilience, especially in multifamily and affordable housing. She also has a major roots in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where GHI is headquartered. Walker Wells is a principal at Ramey & Associates, a consulting service that supports healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. He is a former executive director of Global Green USA and a lecturer in the UCLA planning program. So with that, I will hand it off to Kim, and please take it away.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. So happy to be here. Walker and I from coast to coast, joining you in the Midwest. And really excited. I was just actually in Grand Rapids a couple of weeks ago doing my first travel of 2020, carefully and cautiously. And so very happy to be back in Grand Rapids today through the power of the internet. So Walker and I are going to talk about how equity and resilience fit together in our whole conversation about green affordable housing, and that what we know about how the green characteristics of making affordable housing more sustainable contribute to equity, but also have made the housing that's been built to green standards better able to address a shock like COVID-19. So the topics, where am I? There we go. So the topics we're going to discuss today closely align with our learning objectives. We're going to go through some specific examples of why green affordable housing strategies put buildings and the owners of those buildings and the residents of those buildings in a better position to confront some of the challenges of COVID-19. And that's going to lead us into why thinking about green building strategies are more important than ever, especially as we think about equity and resilience. And then we'll spend a little time saying, okay, COVID-19, this has been such a shock. We've had emergency responses, and that's fine, that's what we had to do, but then how does that compare to some longer term thinking? And finally, Walker and I have trends that we've identified where the affordable green housing movement is going, but COVID-19 has really accelerated those, and so we'll have a conversation together about that. So I think you've seen the learning objectives enough. But to start our conversation about health and housing, I'm going to turn it back to Walker to give us a little historical context.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Yeah, we wanted to sort of frame the discussion about health in the built environment and really how COVID has revealed a lot of historic trends that have become sort of persistent and systemic. Is a little bit of a foundation for this discussion of what can we do with affordable housing and green affordable housing to both address sort of current health-related issues, but some of the issues that have just been created through past decisions, past policies. Just a couple of slides here. This first is really overlaying the dots are overlaid on, which are COVID deaths, are overlaid over the historic mapping of Chicago and Cook County through the home mortgage insurance system, which is really sort of commonly known as redlining. In what we're seeing is that redlining, would create a situation where it was much more difficult to get a mortgage or to borrow money in certain parts of cities. This was generally associated with race. And so what would happen is that certain parts of communities would be disinvested in, and this would lead to lack of investment in maintenance of buildings, and often there could be a corresponding lack of investment in infrastructure that would put certain communities just at a physical disadvantage, make them more exposed and more vulnerable to all kinds of different things. And in this case, we've seen a pattern where sort of COVID deaths have largely overlaid or mapped with these areas that you can see as red and yellow, which were considered to be higher risk from that mindset of redlining or mortgage insurance. If we go to the next slide, then we can see how some of these lending processes and other investments have resulted in a number of sort of corresponding issues. So at the top, you see the redlining map, that's the top left. You can see how that also corresponds to tree canopy cover. So there may have been less public investment in tree canopy, less maintenance in those areas, maybe just less money available to do those types of things, which also overlap on ambient air temperature, heat, and that also corresponds to paved surfaces. So more paved surfaces, less trees combined with heat creates a sort of underlying health risk or level of vulnerability. Then you can have things like COVID or other sort of extreme events overlaid on top of that. And then we have people that are often lower income, facing other vulnerabilities, being exposed to some of these different issues, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's the impacts of climate change. So the question comes forward, what can we do in affordable housing and the design of buildings that's green, but that also is conscious of some of these historic patterns? So as Kim and I have thought about this, we said, well, at the building level, there are a number of strategies that we can apply to make better quality buildings, that they're better insulated, they're designed to operate if the grid goes down, a number of resilient strategies just emerging through fundamentals of green design, and then also through a number of emerging trends thinking about resilience. And then in the resilience movement, we've learned that a cohesive community, engaged residents, people who are positioned to take care of each other is a key ingredient of the resilience equation. So our sort of simple diagram here is really saying if we have better buildings combined with residents that are engaged with each other and engaged with their communities, we're able to create more resilient places, more resilient neighborhoods and communities.
And so to pick up on that, these are just the next few slides, some examples of the specifics of the techniques and the strategies that are deployed in green affordable housing that make them better prepared for some of the things we've seen in COVID, which has been about airborne transmission of virus and concerns about contamination and those kind of things. So the picture on the left, this is a worker going in to do caulking and air sealing at the demising wall so that in a multi-family building, the air does not transfer from one unit to another. compartmentalization in multifamily housing, that's saying let's make each unit be its own six-sided box that is isolated and separated, has its own airflow, its own fresh air, its own exhaust, and is not connected to the corridors and is not connected to the units on either side of it. And tricky places to do that are around the plumbing. So this, the middle picture is air sealing around the tub. You can see that there's gypboard put behind the tub, and actually it's a moisture-resistant backing board, not gypboard. And then that is also caulked to the wall so that there's not airflow behind the tub. And similarly, in the chase, you can see that same wall board behind the chase, so that it can be sealed. And to test how well that all works, the units are blower door tested, each one, to make sure that the air is not flowing. So that compartmentalization that happens in green buildings is really key when we're worried about an airborne disease like COVID, in making sure that the families within each of their units are protected from exposures coming from the other spaces around them. And another important thing, the old expression is build tight but ventilate right. So ventilation needs to be addressed at the unit level, and we have to make sure it functions well. So the picture on the left is a fan coil unit with an ERV built into it, an energy recovery ventilator, so that you have constant background air with direct supply to the unit, but then trying to reduce the energy penalty of ventilation by having that energy recovery element in the ventilation system. The middle picture is showing the combo inlet outlet that's very common in Boston in multifamily units, to have that the inlet and the outlet for the ERV in those the little white box that you see there. And then of course, you can put it in, but if it isn't installed properly and things aren't connected correctly and the ducts aren't sealed, the airflow doesn't work. So of course, testing those flows to make sure they work are really important. So that green building is going to have, it's going to be airtight and have well-controlled air, but then it's also going to have good filtered fresh air ventilation coming in, and the stale air being exhausted. And a local example, this is a priority for Habitat Kent. We featured the Habitat Kent homes as a case study in our book. And I was happy to go back when I was there a couple weeks ago and see the terrific progress that's happened there. But they LEED certify every home, and they make ventilation a priority. So every home has its own energy recovery ventilation system. So on the left is one of the new homes at Plaza Roosevelt, and on the right is the ERV installed in the basement of the home. I'm going to pass it back to Walker for another important element of green buildings that contributes to addressing challenges like COVID.
Yes, so another area that needs to be explored and where there are a lot of opportunities is related to healthy materials. And for years we've looked for materials and set material standards that reduce things like the level of volatile organic compounds that are in paint, flooring, adhesives. Looked for materials that have lower levels or are free of formaldehyde, particularly urea formaldehyde. The Living Building Challenge has sort of taken things to a new level with their red list, and while that list can be quite challenging to fully comply with, there are many examples of healthy products that are chemical free that can be pulled off of the list or from other folks who have pursued these Living Building Challenge certified projects, and particularly those that have gone through their affordable housing cohorts. There's a lot of guidance and examples of things that have worked. The basic idea here is Kim described about good ventilation. So we want fresh air coming in, stale air going out. We also don't want to be introducing contaminants into the living environment. All of, exposure to those things can be respiratory irritants, asthma-related irritants. Again, with COVID being a respiratory disease, we just don't want to be sort of compounding factors or creating a pre-existing condition that makes somebody more susceptible to some negative impact from the COVID pandemic or any other sort of respiratory related illness. You can see some of the case studies on the previous slide. There's an example of the Rose. That's one of our case studies. This next project here is Avery Hill Solar. It's in New Hampshire. You can see how it's designed to be more resilient in terms of having photovoltaic panels to reduce their electricity bills. So this would make it more economically resilient, basically pre-purchasing your energy for 20 or 25 years, so you're less susceptible to increases in energy costs or just fluctuations in energy costs over the course of a day or a month due to high demand. So you're able to make your own energy and have more sort of economic control. And then increasingly, we're seeing this idea of solar plus storage, which is really including batteries with your photovoltaic system. So first step, very efficient building, well sealed, efficient equipment, efficient appliances, pulling down what you see at the bottom, the energy use intensity, so that it's easier to offset the energy use with solar. Then combining that with a battery installation that stores a certain amount of that energy, which is valuable also in managing energy costs, but even more valuable if for some reason the grid goes down, whether it's like what we're experiencing out here in the West, high heat or wildfires, or if there's a cold snap or some other event where the grid isn't functioning. If the property is set up correctly, then it can pull the electricity out of the batteries and continue to operate essential systems, which may be climate control, refrigeration for medicine, lighting, and then cell phone charging and communications in, say, a common space in the building. And if you sort of think through that to the next step, you can also see that that might be some sort of hub of basic services in the broader community. A few more examples here at the orchards at Orenco, another one of our case studies in the book, designed to passive house standards, which means it has a very, very low energy use intensity, largely because of the excellent insulation and air sealing. What that also helps with is maintaining thermal comfort if you don't have access to energy. So that building is not going to heat up or cool down as quickly as a building that isn't designed to such significant energy-related standards, so it will stay comfortable for longer. And then another net zero energy example here, mutual housing at Spring Lake. This is in California. Again, designed to be very energy efficient and then to be able to offset all of its annual energy use over the course of a year through the solar panels that you can see here are both mounted on the roof and then on this carport that's right at the very front of the picture. And more projects are pursuing this net zero energy standard. I think partly out of interest about climate change, 2030 challenge, these types of things. But at least in California, our energy code continues to push projects in this direction. So asking for a level of annual energy use that is possible to obtain through envelope and system strategies, but in most cases, projects are choosing to include solar to, again, sort of be the final component in driving down their net annual energy use, energy pulled from the grid. And so we're seeing a lot of more projects getting very close to net zero energy.
Real quick, I wanted to ask on the solar and net zero and passive house. Obviously, I understand the operational cost side, but what are you seeing? And tell me if you plan to already cover this later. But how are you seeing folks and projects, developers being able to fund these things? Passive house, extra walls, solar. Where are they finding the funds to be able to achieve these things? Which I know, it's always difficult to find funds for affordable housing.
Mm-hmm. Well, step one is always to just bake it into the design. So I think most of the passive house standards are about thoroughness in detailing and construction, and consistency a lot on air sealing, insulation, installation. You know, the item that is often extra for passive house, at least on the West Coast, it will be the heat or energy recovery ventilation system. So that's you know, not always typical in our more sort of benign climates. And then otherwise, you know, it seems to be the case that you can get there with sort of R19, you know, 2x6 framing, R19 walls, R32 in the ceiling, you know, good windows, you know, less than 0.3 on both sides of the equation. So this is all fairly standard stuff. And then I think for the getting to net zero, we're seeing a lot more focus on the hot water systems, and you know, in understanding that the efficient gas boilers are useful, but when you're really trying to balance out your energy with solar, so much of the conversation is around the photovoltaic panels offsetting the energy use. So then you really want everything to be on the, you know, sort of to be electric, so that you're using kilowatt hours and offsetting kilowatt hours. But you know, this gets a little bit into the mechanics of financing of affordable housing. But what one is able to do through virtual net metering is to collect all that solar energy in one place, figure out how to apportion it out to the units, and then make an adjustment to the assumptions on utility costs that each of the residents would be paying. And because affordable housing rents are based on a combination of what people can afford and then a deduction for rent. If you deduct less for rent, sorry, a deduction for utilities. If you deduct less for utilities, you can actually increase the rent a little bit while still keeping everything affordable. And then that's an excellent source of funding that comes in on a monthly basis, even if it's $10 or $15 a month per unit. It can help you borrow some more money. So, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, there's a combination of integrated design and then using some of these innovative tools like virtual net metering, like utility allowance adjustments. And these are ways to, I would probably summarize it to say, get these leading green strategies into the drawings, but also to get these leading green strategies into the project pro forma.
Great, thank you.
And I'll just say in the specific example of the orchards at Orenco, they were able to get some grant funding from a foundation for this first Orenco 1 building to pay for the extra technical assistance and the certification for the passive house. But what they learned from that, they then applied in Orenco 2 and 3. And so they didn't get the certification of the passive house standard, but they found that they could cost effectively, as Walker said, because they planned for it from the beginning, what it took to achieve the standard didn't cost more for them. And so they continued to build differently in the next 2 phases of the project, even though they didn't get them certified. So I think a lot of times if you're able to find people to help with that initial learning curve, that can get you a long way to understanding just how little it really costs to build a much better building. And so to kind of wrap up this first section of you know, how affordable housing is better positioned for dealing with a shock like COVID-19. And I don't know whether it's a cause or effect, but certainly what we found as we talked to the organizations for the case studies in the book is that they are very engaged with their residents, trying as much as possible, even in new construction, to find proxies for the future residents to be part of the conversation about how they're going to build the homes, and then helping residents with green living, providing play spaces, providing outdoor places for people to be, and continuing on a conversation of what does it mean to live green in a green building. And so those owners and those management teams have been better positioned because they already have a strong ongoing relationship with their residents in dealing with the trauma of everything that was happening and how they needed to respond to COVID-19. And one of my observations of COVID-19 and affordable housing is that there's this interesting challenge, because so many of the people who live in affordable housing are actually the essential workers. They're the people who have had to continue to go out to work. And so we have to think even harder about how home is a safe space for them when they come back from their jobs. And then at the same time, the budget pressures mean that affordable housing units keep getting a little smaller and a little smaller. But now we've had a situation where some people are working from home and many students have been learning from home. So there's a whole new set of challenges that affordable housing providers are needing to face. But the fact that they have an ongoing relationship with their residents puts them in a better place to handle that. So before we move into our next section, Brett, have there been any questions we should try to answer now?
Yeah, so going back to ventilation, I was wondering if you took a look actually on the filtration side and what you were seeing as far as filtration, especially in light of COVID and what we know filtration can play a role in that.
So as you're probably aware, MERV 8 is the minimum standard for most of the green building programs. And the challenge with filtration is how sturdy are the fans that are pushing the air across the filters. So I do think that where it's possible, operators have looked into increasing the MERV rating of filters, but sometimes they're just not able to because the fans in the ventilation system are not rated to push air through a heavier filter.
The other question was a sort of comment to air sealing to less than 1 air change per hour is difficult and expensive. And I'm not sure if they're referencing new or existing. I think that could be a big difference. But are there any proven details or products with cost estimates that builders can use to easily, hit low air sealing targets?
So my short answer to the last part of that question is I don't have that information myself. But what we have used in my clients' projects is we've used our trades training time for our LEED integrated design certification to focus on the air sealing. And we have also gotten the architects to include air sealing sheets in the set of architecture plans, so that, and with specific details. And so there's nothing like the contractor knowing that they own it to make them figure it out. In construction contracts, there's a fine line between telling the contractor what needs to happen and telling them exactly how to do it. But we've found the combination of having specific requirements and details, including that the air sealing sheets and the details, and telling the contractors that we'll do on-the-job trades training and they are able to work through the methods. We find that it's a team effort and we have not had problems reaching the air change standards.
I'm so glad you brought up trades training, and I don't want to steal anything away if you plan to address it in a little bit, but we try to recommend the same thing. It's like, okay, you're doing a new project, especially compartmentalization. There's a lot of uncertainty as to whether you're going to meet the compartmentalization standards, which don't use ACH anymore. They use a CFM per volume metric now. But there's a lot of concern there because a lot of teams hadn't recently tested it. So we're like, okay, here's a good 2-for-1. Finish out a unit, white box it, make it your first unit, finish it out, and do your trades training while you're finishing it. Install your HVAC. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, we say it kind of like, this is a great idea, but nobody wants to do it. How do you convince teams that it's important to do the trades training, that it's of value? What is the builder feedback on that?
Well, we tell them from the beginning that they have to pass and that it's it's a team objective that they pass. And so we just we just kind of build it in from the earliest days of the Green Raider and the early site meetings to say, and we usually do that compartmentalization test before the drywall goes on, because the air sealing is happening behind the drywall, at least in the way we're constructing mid-rise buildings here in Boston. And so the contractor doesn't want to fail because they know they're going to have to take everything apart if they fail. So we have not had trouble with GC buy-in on that that testing of the compartmentalization, you know, before, when everything is roughed in, but before things get closed in. And partly it's just that, you know, we're at the job meetings and we say, okay, when is that going to be scheduled? Okay, what trades need to be there? And, you know, by doing that, it becomes part of what is just expected to happen on the job. And we've been lucky that that has worked.
Do you use the same strategy for ductwork as well?
Because we do mostly unit-based systems, the ductwork has been less of an issue. And also we're rarely using furnaces. We tend to use fan coils. And so there's just a lot less ductwork. So we would do the same approach if we had projects with more ductwork.
Well, thank you for taking that little detour with me.
Sure. And I think with that, then let's transition to our second sort of topic, and that is that, you know, COVID-19 has made us think about the equity and the resilience elements of green practices, and that they matter more than ever. So I'm going to pass it back to Walker to talk us through a little table that we built and included in the book in our conversation about this equity, sustainability, affordability equation.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So when Kim and I started working on this book, and it is a revised edition of a previous book that's now 10 or 11 years old, we first focused on all of the new things that were going on and saying, you know, what's changed? And there's a lot. You know, we have established rating systems, emerging rating systems. We have a lot of built projects, increased interest in net zero, solar and storage, more examples of modular. So all kinds of interesting new things to talk about. But as we kind of got into what do we really need to share with people, we kept going back to this idea of the fundamentals and sort of sharpening, I think, the fundamental premise of green affordable housing and why bring these two things together. And I've said for years, like, green is hard, affordable housing is hard. Now we're going to try and do two hard things together. It's going to be super hard. But then we said, well, if we can integrate them, then maybe they're mutually reinforcing, and there's some synergies there. So what this slide aims to do is to just outline the core sustainability aspects of affordable housing, and then show how green building is really augmenting or expanding these benefits, and saying, you know, the point of affordable housing is, you know, there's equity components, making sure people have safe, decent homes, that if you need them, there's social programs, whether it's after school or if it's addiction counseling, supposed to create access to housing, you know, throughout neighborhoods so that we don't create sort of these pockets of poverty, stabilizing housing costs, putting housing close to transit and jobs to reduce costs related to just moving around and, you know, open up pathways to opportunity. And then historically, there's been a lot of discussion about affordable housing as part of the smart growth conversation and supporting transit use, reduce vehicle miles traveled, reduce vehicle emissions of, you know, pollutants or greenhouse gases. And so we said, what happens when we slide in green building? And so we say, well, you know, we help on the equity side. It's not just dealing with economic issues, but it's improving health by some of the things we've talked about with materials and ventilation, also encouraging walking, biking, even the stair location can help people be more physically active. Thinking about the impacts on the construction workers. They're the ones often who are using the paints and adhesives, you know, on a daily basis and most exposed to them. We think about the economy of really having these be long-term valuable public investments, and then expanding that environmental area, as we've discussed, reducing energy use, reducing water use, planning for stormwater capture, making renewable energy on the roof, using recycled content materials. Now, when we sort of again, looked at this in the context of sort of current events, whether it's climate or COVID, you start to see that a lot of these strategies are beneficial from that standpoint. So energy efficiency, the original argument was to reduce costs, but it also will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A greenhouse gas, mitigation measure. A well-sealed, well-insulated building is an efficiency strategy, but if it maintains thermal comfort for an extended period of time, then that becomes a resilience strategy. And then many of the things that we've done sometimes for health, like the unit compartmentalization was always a health issue, but it was often described as not getting smoke, carbon monoxide, smells, and yes, pathogens to move between units. But we're certainly thinking much more about pathogens. Air, the filtration, the MERV 8, 11, or 13 was also more about getting particulates out of the air. But we've also learned that that has sort of again, a health benefit from a pathogen dispersal standpoint. So I think what we're seeing is that in light of climate change, in light of COVID, a lot of the fundamentals hold true, and actually their value is enhanced, which I think was a good finding for us, Kim, to say, how are all this stuff we've been writing responsive to current conditions, and I think seeing that there's actually a lot there in the fundamental of green buildings and addressing some of our current crises. And then a couple months ago, Kim and I, this is back in May, said, well, what could we say around these topics? And a lot of what I just said, is captured in this article that's in Shelter Force. And you can see the link there that basically says, COVID-19 is changing how we think about the places that we live, because it's asking us to be, socially distanced. It's also asking us to be inside more. So we said, again, how do these green strategies play into this, and are there things that maybe we need to be, emphasizing even more? Just quickly, a couple of things that came up right away, which is what's in this image. It's a project in Los Angeles called the Crest, a really beautifully designed landscaping. It's a series of housing units for the formerly homeless. They're all very small, and the understanding was that the residents really needed an outside space where they could, get out of their units, congregate, talk to each other, but also connect with nature. So I think this integration of open space, landscape, all kind of around these ideas of biophilia becomes increasingly important if we're going to continue to be sort of sequestering or isolating ourselves. We see a lot of mental health benefits out of caused by access to nature. And then a lot of these discussions we've already had about filtration, air sealing, thinking about how to really compartmentalize and isolate the units and protect the residents' health through the building systems. A simple shift that's happened out here is I see much more filtration of the air before it gets into the dwelling units with some small inline filter, often MERV 11, with a fan, a push fan. And that's a shift from what has been done, for quite a while, which is to sometimes just have a passive opening ducted to the return of the air handler, and then the only filtration happened once you turned on the air handler and the air hit the return of the air handler. So you could actually be introducing outside air that wasn't filtered unless somebody turned on, again, the air handling unit. So I think this presence of line filters is going to become an increasingly common strategy to meet the ventilation requirements, but also as a response to COVID.
So, as we said, we wrote a book, and it's always interesting. You write a book, and we felt like it's still really important to have an all-in-one place guide to the essential knowledge that teams, especially project managers, but really the whole ecosystem of affordable housing needs to have an understanding of and on their mind as they build housing, fund housing, operate housing. And we really wanted to cultivate a systems-based approach. But then, the COVID, the social equity, the racial equity concerns, our whole setup of the book of green for affordable housing really being an essential component of introducing equity into the world of sustainability, and that to really have long-term affordable housing, the sustainability practices and principles need to be there, that these things are all together. So we hope that we brought that together in the book, put affordable housing in the context of doing its part to against climate and for climate change, climate action. And then we're really excited that there are 14 case studies, mostly of projects, but a couple of lead for neighborhood development with master planning scale, thinking about green, because we're practitioners and we know that practitioners learn best from other practitioners and from case studies and examples. So we're very excited that we have 14 new projects, including, as I said, the Habitat Camp homes in over at Plaza Roosevelt. And so we've got the essential information and strategies that folks need to know to be successful. And that's integrated design. It's really more detail about thinking about envelopes and systems, and then a whole new chapter, expanded chapter on operations and asset management and the role that plays. And of course, we have to talk about costs and financing and ways to think about the total cost and benefit package around green strategies and affordable housing, and then make sure that we're all prepared to lean into trends and as well as shocks. So that is what is in the book. And we hope that you have a chance to check it out and that someone will win a copy. Are there, before we transition into our next topic, any other questions that have come up, Brett?
Yeah, and I don't know if you're planning again to get to this or not, but they had just mentioned, one of the attendees said something about your use of the term resiliency, or how they think you're using the term. And you know, they're just saying the way they use it is you know, buildings that can resist the effects of climate change. So I guess, what are your thoughts and the kind of way they interpret it versus kind of the way you're using that term?
Walker, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, I think you know, this may be a little more sort of metaphorically or whatever, but you know, it's often like, you know, be able to bend and not break, you know, or to bounce back. So, you know, I often think of a spring or a palm tree that can, you know, like flop way over and then come back up. And so so I think sort of resistance to the impacts of climate change is, you know, that certainly works. I think the question is, how are you being resistant? And so is it to, you know, set up a hardening, you know, which would probably be a thicker wall, more insulation, better windows, or are we also looking at some of the softer systems, which would be more of the social systems, and how are also the residents prepared to manage whatever your threat or vulnerability may be, or, you know, how is the building designed to sort of, you know, take on a different characteristic or pattern of use in light of some extreme event. So, you know, the things that everybody seems to be experiencing is heat in these instances of high heat, and thinking of the building being perhaps the community room being a place where there's cooling for the residents, but even again for the neighborhood. I think we're all have seen instances of losing power, which is why the discussion about batteries. So this is a way for the building to kind of change its operations to say, well, everything won't work, but the essential things will be able to work for 72 hours. So I think this is about, in the design process, thinking about maybe some of these outlier events and to put in systems that can do something different in that moment of crisis than they might do during a normal state of affairs. So, yeah.
I would add to that, you know, we need to be thinking about resilience quite broadly, and there's the chronic stressors, and so and then we have the shocks, right? So, even, for example, some of the examples we've given. So PV, solar electricity, is a great way for mitigating, you know, the contribution that carbon is making to climate change. So that is a resilience strategy. But then having the battery backup makes you more resilient to a system shock, right? And same thing with the heat example that Walker gave. If we build better envelopes, spaces stay cooler, or we can create shaded courtyards, but then in a shock of a major heat wave, having spaces where people can come to cool down, that's important. So our sense of how we respond to resilience in terms of our buildings needs to be responding to what we expect to be chronic stressors and what we've, you know, experienced as shocks. And then we have to think beyond buildings. We have to think about organizational resilience, residential resilience. The people like to talk about social cohesion. You know, when there's a crisis, we need to be able to function together to make change, to respond, to protect, to rescue. And if we aren't building that social cohesion in our human networks and systems, whether it's in our organizations, in our resident communities, in the neighborhoods and districts that our buildings and our organizations are based in, we're not going to be resilient. So I like to think of resilience as having a much broader range of dynamics, and that organizations that are thinking ahead really need to be thinking across all of those dimensions.
I'm glad you brought up the social cohesion, because the idea before was, right, wider hallway spaces or you know, stair spaces so people maybe can interact and meet, right, in these community shared places, which right now all that sounds horrifying. I mean, just to be honest with you, right, you want to get away from that. So what has happened now? What are some new strategies that maybe you've seen or heard now to help maintain that social cohesion, where now we do have to sort of put it on pause for a little while?
Well, that's actually kind of a good segue into our third topic area of like the immediate versus the longer term. And, you know, maybe we can have some of our participants just put into questions or in the chat some of what they've experienced. So, of course, there's been this physical shutting down, right, and focus on isolation. But then several of the groups I know here in the Boston area, they have organized delivery, like on-site farmers markets, so that residents have an ability to get fresh food without having to go out to the grocery store or go to the farmers market. And you know, everybody has moved their programming to Zoom. And so organizations have worked hard to do individual reaching out to families and creating online programming, really trying hard to make a point of connecting with people. That's some of the, you know, emergency responses that I've heard to try to keep people connected and make sure they're on needs. But I would love to hear what others have heard or have been doing, and how, as we slowly, cautiously hope we can start to reconnect, how are people thinking about the safety?
Yeah, I was just add, you know, I think it's very much a work in progress, and the way that Kim described it, you know, is very much on point. That I think we are still effectively in this crisis management emergency response mode, you know, where we have had to stop doing things, and you know, whether it is, you know, interacting with each other using, you know, open spaces, you know, sending the, you know, kids down to the common room, you know, to do their homework. What I think is important is, in the middle of a crisis, or, you know, wherever we are, is to be thinking long term and to say, oh, do we need to recognize that, you know, potentially these health, you know, related issues are you know, persistent, will be a, you know, continued factor in society. We need to be thinking about those as we're, you know, designing new buildings, you know, and not be you know, perpetuating some of those historic inequities that have been in place, you know, in the past. So, you know, one thing that's certainly come up is, like, not everybody has great internet service, and you have, you know, you're working at home and your kids are taking school at home, and everybody's fighting over the bandwidth. that could be making it difficult for, lower income folks to be able to continue to be part of the economy, or for kids to do well at school. So we don't want, the shift to online to just be exacerbating inequities that we already know are present. And so I think this may be a good topic for a future event. Now that we have an idea of what to do in the moment, what should we be thinking about doing, in the future in response to COVID? And not to be doom and gloom, but you read about this stuff, and this may not be the only pandemic that we're facing in the next 25 to 50 years. So it'd be good to think ahead.
Yes, and in our little list here of longer term thinking, so certainly I've heard of some amazing improvised broadband and Wi-Fi access, because for many people their broadband access is their phone data plan, and so they've been trying to have their kids go to school based on using their phone as a hotspot. And I have heard of people bringing buses in. In one community, I heard they got school grants to install Wi-Fi routers and access to make sure that all the families with kids in school would be able to access the network. So there's some creative thinking, but now increasingly I'm seeing the funding programs have flagged this, and it's not enough to provide the wires as a requirement in the funding program, but you actually have to demonstrate how you're going to give families that access. It's becoming as essential as electricity for families to have to be able to function. So I think, over the longer term, we're going to go from the emergency, have the bus show up and park in the parking lot to give Wi-Fi access, to thinking about, is it broadband, is it wired, is it Wi-Fi? How do we make sure that we have bandwidth that people need for the things they're now needing to do at home?
Just to wrap this up a little bit, up in this idea of resilience, I think, because a number of us have gone through some of these, what do we do about resilience questions, and talked about, the long-term stresses and the shocks. I think we've realized that ideally, whatever intervention you're making is having day-to-day benefits, as well as providing some, service, when those stressors have compounded and or the shock has emerged. So, we have ended up talking a fair amount about solar and storage, but, used correctly, those batteries can modulate energy costs and help you avoid paying, time of use charges for peak energy rates. On an ongoing basis, lowering your bills. And then in the moment of crisis, you have the ability to operate autonomously to the grid. So I think, there may be some simple thinking to say, let's make sure that our community room could also function as some sort of school from home facility, and just ask the architect to do that layout, as well as the, whatever assembly layout, or, whatever birthday party, family reunion layout. And so I think we're really seeing these sort of like stacking of the day-to-day with the resilience is when it isn't extra, it is an extra cost. And I think that's a bit of the think different, to just bring that question into the room. How does this provide a resilience benefit, or could it? Which isn't a question that we've always asked ourselves.
And that kind of brings us to our final point that we wanted to make. And, as we were putting the book together, we're saying, well, we want people to have a solid grasp of the basics and be doing those in projects, because it's never a static world. Things are always changing. So we had identified 4 trends, and then COVID has just made us realize how much those are accelerating. So maybe, Walker, you can just quickly talk us through these, and then I think we've got a few minutes for questions yet.
Sure. So certainly COVID has helped draw these connections between housing and health, and back to those early diagrams that we showed about the overlap of sort of redlining and incidence of COVID. In many of those areas that were historically redlined, there had not been investment in housing, and so the housing is of poor quality. So there could be drafty, there could be poor combustion in some of the furnace. There may be pests. All of these things are sort of well-known healthy housing issues that you're trying to ameliorate, so people aren't being, sort of constantly exposed to these conditions that put them in a negative position. And so, we've sort of said, yes, it's density, it's essential workers, it's the need to take transit, but it's also the quality of the housing. So I think we're seeing that, affordable housing that's green addresses the economic part as well as the health part. This isn't my quote. It's one of the board members of Enterprise who talks about housing being a vaccine against a whole number of other health-related issues. A main thing that secure housing does is take away a huge amount of stress, which can have many negative health outcomes. And I think we get people stabilized and then we want them in a healthy condition. So that's really been emphasized. And then we go down these sort of technical discussions about MERV 13 filters and compartmentalization. A number of folks have said, COVID is sort of warm up for climate change. And, if this has been disruptive, wait till you see the impacts of climate change on electricity grid security, heat patterns, weather patterns. So I think it's showing us an increased urgency to be baking resilience into sort of at least thinking about it around every decision and baking it into our projects and not seeing it as something that's extra or can be added on later. We've talked a fair amount about social and racial equity and about how these historic systemic inequities and racism have really been revealed by COVID in how the infection and death rates have occurred. What it's lifting up is some of the discussion about, well, where should we be investing? Are we just trying to invest today from an equality standpoint? Sort of each neighborhood gets its fair share. Are we actually trying to emphasize investment in certain parts of the city that have been historically disinvested, neglected over the years, and really to say it's okay to do something disproportionate to ameliorate, a historic failure or injustice. And then we touched on a little bit of this earlier, but my background's urban planning, so I've always been interested in how the green affordable housing projects can be a catalyst for broader sustainability change in a neighborhood, and we're starting to think more and more about the green strategies at the neighborhood scale. So resilience discussion certainly brings it up to say, well, if it's a safe place for the residents to go, if the grid is down, could it be a safe place for certain people in the neighborhood to go as well? If it's, people with medical conditions or elderly or whatever, if they need some place of refuge, or it's just a place, to put their insulin in a refrigerator so that it doesn't go bad. But other green strategies at the neighborhood scale that, have emerged are, bike parking, so people can ride their bike in the neighborhood and not necessarily need a car. Transit connections, pedestrian connections. At least in California, a lot of discussion about EV charging, recognizing that electric vehicles coming off a lease are actually quite affordable, and electricity is cheaper than gas. So having an electric vehicle may actually be economically advantageous and something that low-income families should have access to. And then I think finally seeing housing in the context of what else is in the neighborhood, and looking eco districts does this well, to say what are the other assets that are potentially there and what are missing, and what type of partnerships should we be looking at that augment the housing. So there's just a few of the trends that we see out there on the kind of emerging on the horizon.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of what we had to say. And so if you are interested in purchasing the book, you can buy it directly from our publisher and use Wells for 20% off. It's of course available at Amazon and at Barnes & Noble. And it's available if you want to support your local bookstore, you can go to this bookshop.org site and order it through your local store. So many different ways, and it's available as a book, and it's available as an ebook as well if you prefer that. So,
yeah. And I can see I just bought a couple things through bookshop.org, and it worked really well. And the portion of it gets directed to my local bookstore here in Venice Beach, which is, only open a little bit by appointment, but I, would sure be ashamed to see that bookstore go away. So if I encourage that option, and it's pretty easy to find whatever your local bookshop is, or whichever bookshop around the country you think you want to be supporting.
So with that, I think we can hand it back to you, Brett.
Yeah, thank you. And so we do have some time for questions and for the book winner announcement. So, but real quick before we get to those, for those of you watching this, please take that survey that pops up when you close out, or take the one that's sent to you an hour later. Only take it once. Even if you don't need CEUs, please take it. For those of you watching this on demand in the future, not live, go to our YouTube link at the bottom. Click on that, click on Show More, and then on the right side, go down to the CEU section, click on that, follow the instructions there, or follow the instructions on GBCI, wherever you're taking this quiz, to get your to take your quiz and get an 80% passing rate to get your certificate. And again, before we get to those questions and the book winner announcement, a huge thanks to our top tier sponsors, Mitsubishi Electric, Rheem, Build Equinox, CRV, and a huge thanks to our volunteers, our board of directors, everyone who allows us to do what we do. And I wanted to give a shout out to Jay Alex. You are the winner today, so congratulations on winning the book. As Kim pointed out, you can get a physical copy or a PDF handout, and I'll connect you to after this, and you guys can go from there. And Jay, if you're listening, I'd love to get a photo of you holding it when you get it, or you holding your computer next to you, I guess, if you do the virtual one, that you got the book, and we always just like to share that out if you can. So it's not required, but I'll connect you to. Congrats on winning. So yeah, let's see some questions coming in. One of them was a pretty in-depth question. I'm going to kind of break it up a little bit. Just, from an affordable standpoint, I mean, what's going on the exterior? Are you seeing opportunities for native plants, pollinator gardens, rainwater catchment, which can be a 2-for-1, we're understanding, depending on the legal codes. We could use it to flush our toilets, drink water, and to stop stormwater, 2-for-1. What are you seeing out there?
Well, I can speak from what's happening in Boston. Here, especially in the city itself, we're pretty much required to manage all stormwater on site now, up to about a 95th percentile event. And so that is mostly people are doing on-site underground retention with eventual infiltration into the ground. But then also in some cases trying to think about simple rain gardens. People's experience is their rain gardens don't maintain themselves, and so it can be a maintenance challenge to do that. But we're definitely seeing drought tolerant and native landscaping used a lot more to reduce the amount of potable water that landscapes need. Using rainwater for toilets is very complicated as far as needing double plumbing piping, needing effectively on-site water cleaning. Even if it's not potable water going into the toilets, there's still a very high level of cleaning that the codes require. So that, at least in our context, water is expensive, but not so expensive that people are moving to using rainwater for toilet flushing yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I see quite a bit of on-site stormwater management. Some of that's driven by the code. At least in the city of Los Angeles, they have you sort of direct infiltration or sort of capture and slow release, and you have to demonstrate that neither of those two are possible before you can do some kind of mechanical filtration. So big shift in sort of civil engineering practices. Most of our landscaping is low water or drought tolerant. There aren't too many people who take that next step into natives and or sort of pollinator or edible landscape. So I'll just say this is what I often feel is sort of the job of the green building advisor or practitioner, is to say, okay, this isn't in LEED, it's not in whatever rating system you're working with, but these are still some good ideas that we might want to be considering. Edible landscape. Could the landscaping not just be pretty, but could it produce something that we can eat? And then to Kim's point, I'm again in California. I was talking about a drought, but water is still cheap. So it's difficult to justify financially a big investment in gray water reuse. And then our weather pattern is such that it rains only for part of the year. So you could have a full cistern when it's raining, and then you would drain it by June, and then you would have an empty cistern. It hasn't rained yet. So like, I don't know, November. So the rainwater capture isn't so smart, but the gray water reuse makes a heck of a lot of sense from a systems source sink perspective. Your shower water is really the amount of water you need to flush your toilets over the course of a day, maybe a little bit more, but the cost, it just never pencils. So it comes up, it gets talked about, and then it falls by the wayside. But I think that eventually either the water imperative will emerge, or the systems will get simpler to design and permit and maintain.
Well, Brett, you're on.
Great.
Brett, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. We had some comments that came in from our users suggesting mesh networks for internet access to each apartment. Someone shared that they have a STEM nonprofit that brings mobile STEM to the neighborhoods now with all the school challenges. Great comment from one of our members came in here about basically air quality monitoring being set up through the buildings as a new future strategy, especially as we're starting to understand that CO2 can be a potential equivalent for COVID spread and influenza spread. So if we know there's high CO2 buildup, which causes all sorts of other problems, especially as we're working from home, but we could also infer then that there is potential COVID spread if there's a lot of CO2 as one of the metrics to look at. So that was just one of their comments, like making that very important. Are you seeing these smarter systems, these air quality detection systems getting used, or are they still a niche kind of high-end thing?
I would say that's not yet. I would say that
I've never seen one, but let's see what Kim says. Sorry, you've seen them?
not yet, no. I would say everyone's still in the emergency response, starting to make the list of things we need to look into, not yet implementing those interesting ideas.
Yeah, and I think just in housing, to me, that feels like a well building strategy that you might see in a high-end office building or something. I'm trying to think of how the monitoring could even work in a in people's individual units, but potentially, I mean, it's interesting. I think this CO2 as a proxy for COVID spread it's a very interesting observation. So thanks for sharing that.
I also wonder whether our friends at ASHRAE will start to rethink this, because the background ventilation standards in ASHRAE 62.2 I think are pretty low, and they're based on assumptions about occupancy over the course of the day, and so are they too low if we have a situation where suddenly 5 people are in a space 24/7? And are the systems designed in a way that those numbers can be easily adjusted so that we can increase the flow rate if it turns out we should have a higher flow rate?
Yeah, that's interesting.
I hope our friends at ASHRAE are starting to fuss about these things and will have suggestions for us in the not too distant future.
I think we're used to the humidistat sensor, the occupancy sensor, but the CO2 sensor isn't common in housing. And one thing I've learned a while ago is that it is important to make these design decisions based on the level of maintenance that's expected. And it is often heartbreaking to go back to a project where you came up with a very clever, very sophisticated solution and it's been turned off because nobody knows how to maintain it. So I think back to fundamentals, I think I'm often saying, like, let's just use the thing that does the job. It's fairly simple to maintain. It's easy to access, and it's not, and it's time tested. So, we're having this conversation now with this, very rapid increase in the, electric heat pump boilers, and, trying to understand the systems are there, but to not have a whole lot of track record of them used in the multifamily application, so that we're confident that there'll be the service technicians and just the predictability. You don't want to be stuck only using gas because it's what but we also don't want to burden an affordable housing developer with something that is too difficult to maintain, and is a liability. So this is also part of our job, is to figure out when we're ready to kind of make a shift to a new approach.
Well, I'm glad you brought up boiler. The other question here was, what are your overall thoughts on those tankless gas water heaters? I know, 10 years ago, they were one of the green building saviors, right? You got to install these if you want to be the greenest project around. And now, we're seeing issues with maintenance. And I just think I saw the NRDC report about if you don't turn your tap water on far enough, these tankless gas water heaters kick out methane all over the place, high levels of it. So just what are you seeing out there, and what you'd mentioned electric boilers, but are you still seeing a lot of these tankless water heaters as a way to get low gas demand?
I'm not. Mostly what I've seen, probably the scale of the buildings that I've worked on, which are more the 3 to 5 story buildings that are 50 units and above. The trend has just been the central gas boiler with the solar thermal preheat. And that became the sort of approved approach for a good 6 or 7 years. And then now I do see the shift towards the electric boiler, the electric heat pump hot water heater. Sometimes on the roof, no solar thermal preheat for various engineering reasons about how heat pumps work. And then I've started to see a shift towards individual tank electric heat pump water heaters. So starting to put the water heating unit in the dwelling unit, or to have like 3 of them or 4 of them in series per floor of the building. I don't know if I have an opinion about what's best, but what I always loved about the tankless or the central boiler is you save so much space. So you didn't have to have a little room in every apartment building to put the water heater in. So now that we see them coming back like into the closet on the balcony, it feels like 1976. Kim, I believe, has drawn my attention to the fact that they need a fair amount of space, I think, I feel like the tanks are bigger, and I think like you may have brought this up to me, Kim, one of our conversations. So let's talk about what you're seeing out in Boston.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. We still have a lot of central heating and cooling systems in mid-rise buildings, and those are gas fired. I would say the most typical is a fan coil unit, where in heating season, a boiler is sending hot water to the fan coil, and in the cooling season, a chiller is sending cold water to the pipes in the fan coil. Yeah. There's been some move toward the on-demand unit-based to provide heating and hot water in the unit, but we honestly are getting this really rapid shift to electrification. And with many Boston, Cambridge, Brookline, all the cities right in the Boston metro area moving to carbon neutral policy statement, and then anybody getting public money has to show that they're meeting the policy. So we're seeing this very rapid shift to air source heat pumps for heating and cooling. Hot water is tricky. So one of the challenges with heat pump water heaters is they need quite a bit of free air in order to do their work. And so if you put them in a unit, they have to be air coupled to the larger unit. So they either need to be in an alcove and not in a closet, or it has to be a closet that's essentially a grill for the door. And then they cool down the surrounding air. So in LA, they don't care because they turn on the heat 3 days a year.
But, a little more than that, but yeah.
In New England, you have to have heat available from September 15 to June 15, right? And so that means that you've got a lot of time when you're paying to heat the air and your water heater is cooling the air down. And then they also make noise, and so there's some sound things. So I have been reluctant to push people into heat pump water heaters as an individual unit situation. And as Walker said, we're still all learning by doing on whether you can have 3 heat pumps in the mechanical room in a larger complex and have kind of central hot water using heat pumps. I have not seen engineers willing to try that yet in my clients' projects. So I think that the gas use, newsflash, 10 years from now, no one will be allowed to put gas into new buildings, right? So that switch hasn't happened yet. It has happened here in Boston, but it's going to happen other places as well. So that's one newsflash. And then, what's the right type of heat pump? From a pure energy use point of view, a water to air heat pump is the most energy efficient. So whether it's a ground source, ground coupled, or even using a boiler for a little bit of heat and using that for the air, but it's not the cheapest, right? So the boxes that go on the wall are the cheapest way to put a heat pump in a unit, right? So, but the heat pump technology is changing rapidly, and the adoption of it is just accelerating. So we will find ways to incorporate heat pump into water heating systems and figure out the central versus the unit based. But it's still, my view is it's still very much a work in progress.
Well, Kim, Walker, we are out of time and I don't see any other questions, but I thank you so much for joining us, and congrats to our book winner. Jay Alex will connect you with them too. And before we wrap up, where can people go to find more information or learn more about the book?
The easiest is to go to Island Press, our publisher, islandpress.org, and just search. But of course, Amazon as well.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
People can get in touch with us as well. I don't know if our.
Oh yeah, where can they contact you? Thank you.
We may have forgotten to put that slide in the deck.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll send contact info to Brett and you can post it. Brett.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for your time today. Have a great rest of your week. Take care, everyone. Stay safe out there. Stay healthy. Stay masked. Stay in. Take care. Bye.
And Brett.